Well, hi, Robby. I'm so glad to have a chance to chat with you today about this important topic, the topic of what are parks and why do we need them? And so I know that you have worked in the field for a long time and we've had a chance to work together, but I thought this might be really a nice way for us to just kind of present some topics around your thoughts and the experience that you have. I know that you're a fellow with the American Society for Landscape Architecture, and you bring a kind of vast experience. And so I'm just going to ask you some questions and love to hear what you have to say. So first, just to get started for our viewers, can you talk about your background and experience around this topic?
Sure. I'm a landscape architect. I got my bachelor's degree at Texas Tech University, went on to get a master's degree in landscape architecture at University of Colorado, and then a PhD in design at North Carolina State University in the College of Design. What that really means is that I've been basically immersed in the study of landscape architecture throughout my entire career, focused a lot on the public landscape, the public realm. And I like to tell people, I spent the first half of my career trying to design great parks, and the second half of my career trying to figure out how they actually work. And that's really where the scholarly and academic side of it comes, where I wanted to delve more into really what are parks, what do they mean, how do they work, how do they affect people, what are the beneficial outcomes from parks. And so I became really immersed in that through the course of my career.
Just a little bit more. This might sound like a really basic, silly question, but from your viewpoint, can you talk about your thoughts on what a park is?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd never really thought much about what a park really is until I was working on my dissertation and reading in the scholarly literature at all these various studies done on parks, and realized in most of them, nobody bothered to explain what they really meant when they were talking about parks. And looking a little deeper into it, I realized that there's a lot of ambiguity around that term, that phrase. So I looked a bit into the history of it, of that actually word park in the English language, and came upon the kind of an evolution. It's kind of interesting that the word park started out referring to private spaces that were set aside for people of means to enjoy the land on a level that goes beyond the basic needs of shelter, food, clothing, those kinds of things. Parks, actually, if you think about it, were leisure spaces. They were for this other activities that were beyond our basic subsistence. And originally, park was used as a word to describe those places that people who could afford to do so set aside for their own use. But over time, that became democratized, really, became available to the general public, and the word came to refer to places like that are available to the general public. Although if you go back in time, you realize that part of the reason for that transition was a recognition that access to those kinds of spaces were really beneficial for people's health. And that was considered important enough to make parks available, or make those kinds of places available to all people, to the masses, so to speak, from a public health standpoint. And that was really what drove that evolution from making parks from private spaces to public spaces, was a public health imperative.
Okay, great. So when you talk about a park, I'm assuming it's like a geographically designed area, because I know sometimes when we're planning for parks, we're looking at parks, open space, greenways are often considered like linear parks. So are those all under that broad umbrella of parks, or how do you use that word?
Yeah, and I think the word will continue to have different meanings and different applications. So it depends on the context that it's used within. But I think if we want to focus in on what park professionals and people who study parks, I think there's where we need to come together and say, well, what do we mean when we're talking about a park? To me, it is a place. You're right. It can be identified geographically as a particular place. And it has an intention of providing for these outdoor exposure primarily, although some parks have indoor spaces. But to me, a park really is the outdoor part of that. To me, it's really a place that's put there for the sake of recreation, leisure, exposure to the outdoors and nature in a way that can provide these beneficial outcomes back to the people that are exposed to them.
Well, that's interesting. So you mentioned earlier about parks kind of being this equal access space. Can you talk a little bit about, in your work, how you plan better for equitable access? How do you minimize that kind of gentrification challenge?
I don't know if I have the answer to that, but I do have a lot of thoughts on it. It occurred to me that for me on a personal level, the way I went down the road to some of the work that you and I have collaborated on for the last 20 plus years came about looking at equity for not a disadvantaged population, but for an advantaged population. I was working on a project in a community doing a park system master plan. And there was a particular neighborhood that had very large homes, very wealthy homes. And they were actually, probably the finest neighborhood in town. And in a public meeting, I informed this neighborhood that they weren't meeting the standards because they didn't have a neighborhood park within their access. And their response to this neighborhood group was, well, we had one, but it got obsolete and needed to be renovated. And we said, well, don't bother. We don't really need it. We don't need a playground. We don't need that kind of a park, a typical neighborhood park, because we've got our big lots and we all have all those things. But we would really like to have an equestrian park because a lot of us have horses. And I thought, well, how do you begin to say, what is the value of a typical neighborhood park against the value of some other kind of park? A park doesn't have to be a park, a park, a park, a park. How do you establish value so that this community could get their fair share without just rubber stamping and duplicating something they had and didn't want in the first place? So it's interesting. I started thinking about equity from the standpoint of providing for people who were an advantaged population, but then those same techniques to define value for what they wanted as opposed to what someone else might need or want led me down that road. And then we began to collaborate on this sort of stuff to figure out how to determine what equity is. And once that happened, we could use it to apply it in both directions. The other thing has happened over the last 20 years or so is a recognition, a reemergence of the health imperative for parks and the desire on the part of a recognition, I'll say, on the part of our society that parks are really beneficial things to provide to all communities, and that it is a health intervention for public health. And that from an environmental justice standpoint, if we're providing that health intervention to the public, it needs to be equitably distributed. And particularly now we realize those communities that can benefit the most from it, I'll say. And so that has led us to look at equity now, not just from the standpoint of giving everybody their equal share or fair share, even though it might be a different kind of park in one place versus another, if we can measure the value and provide equal value in a different way in each of those places. But how do we also measure need and now match equity? Well, has become more of what is called environmental justice, which is making sure that the people who may be disadvantaged by various societal mechanisms get the adequate amount of this societal benefit that's being provided now by the governmental structure that allows us to tax people and provide for places we call parks as a public benefit.
So Robby, I know that one of the things that you have worked on is a variety of research briefs for GPRED, and especially around this topic of how we measure parks. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you included in that?
Sure. As I was saying, exploring the literature on parks and realizing that there's some ambiguity around the use of that term, I did a little more research into the etymology and evolution of that word. And some of that information that I came across is included in a research brief that GPRED has published, and it's now available on the GPRED website.
Wonderful. So as you talk about providing, equity, and I know I've long been interested in this idea of what is equity, or how do you even look at that from a park space? But can you talk a little bit about why it's more important what's in the parks, on a component basis versus rather than just having access to something, or is that all they need is access to something, or is it more important to have the components that they need?
I think we're learning that access is more than just a physical distance or even the nature of that route along that physical distance. And that really access is about, if a park is over there, but I don't feel like I belong there, or there's nothing there for me, then I really don't have, I mean, that's limiting my access. That's not true access. So we're beginning to look at access on a much broader level in terms of not just the resource and where it is in proximity to someone, but also what the resource that's available to them is, what resources are available to them within proximity to where they are. And that, you know, is really as much or more important than just providing. Equity is, it gets back to what I was saying earlier. Equity isn't just about giving everybody the same thing. It's about giving people the right thing in an equivalent way. So a lot of our work has been based on that. The component thing you just talked about gets back to that, because that was really how I began to explore this idea of equity back, like I said, in the very beginning, when I had someone who wanted a different kind of park than the typical neighborhood park would be. And I thought, well, how do we assign those values? And that led me to looking at what's in them and how do you assign a value to the pieces, the elements, the components that are within them. And that led me and us, as we discussed this, you know, us and our colleagues working together to discuss, well, how do we measure the value of those things? We look at what it is, what it's intended to do. Does it meet its function? And that becomes important, because then that gets into the quality of something, as opposed to just, does the playground exist or not? Yeah, actually it gets into the quality of what kind of playground is it? How good is it? Does it fit the need it's expected to meet? Those lots of other kinds of questions that we can begin to assess. And then once we assess those variables, we can begin to assign value to them. And then we can begin to compare value of one place to another based on the things that are within it.
So if you are coming in and you're representing kind of, you know, the community planner, the parks planner for a given community, how do you know when we've achieved our goals?
That's a good question. Well, I guess it's clear definition of the goals, because when you define the goals, you can also define how, you know, what the metrics are, how do we know if we've accomplished them? And that doesn't necessarily mean, even if you set all these goals and you know exactly how to measure your outcomes, that doesn't necessarily mean you've created the best. It just means you've created the one you set out to create, right? Because I think that question still exists, and it's going to, it's a big question that hasn't really been answered, is how do we know, you know, how do we know a good park from a bad park? You know, we don't really have a clear measure that says this one's good and that one's bad. We can look at outcomes. We can, you know, how many people use the place, what is their energy expenditure in that place in physical activity terms. We can look at other indicators around those things. There's a lot of ways to measure. We still don't have, you know, sort of this easy way to say, okay, is this park better than that one? And by how much? Or is it a good park or a bad park? Well, I think that we're, as a discipline, are all beginning to understand that the answer to that quality and what is good really does lie in who is using it, in the user. And I think that's one of the big aha for me. You know, I really went into my dissertation research thinking, well, I'd find these, you know, 3 or 4 variables as a designer that I could design into a park, and they would tell me that, you know, that's how I know where to put it and what's going to be great. And I think what I learned is that in my research, actually, in my data, I realized that the most important variables on whether or not someone was going to use a park was not the park itself as much as who the person was. And so those demographic variables, those variables of, you know, whether the person's age and their culture and their, you know, do they have children, or those kinds of things, have a much greater effect on usage of a place or a park than necessarily what's in it. The other piece that really does matter and is harder to measure because of what we were just talking about is the quality of it. So in my research, I was able to identify quality as a significant variable, but not really nail down what that truly means. I think we would have I could have better results in my research if I had a better measure of quality. I had a really good measure of quality. And I think,
don't you think that's subjective though, what quality is? We're back to that individual. I mean,
we are, but I think that,
yeah,
subjectivity isn't always bad. I mean, you know, perception is reality, and some people say. And so, yeah, if we can But if we can identify how perception and therefore perceived quality works, then we can begin to use that to, explore more about how to put quality into these places for
Mhm.
specific locations and specific populations.
Right. So thinking about it, I mean, I know we both believe this, that parks are great. Obviously, we did our careers to more parks and more recreation. But if you were talking to a younger professional, how do we get more parks? What's your recommendation there?
That varies from place to place, because putting parks in new places, new communities, is, we still grow in this country by moving out, by, greenfield development and building new places rather than rebuilding old places. I'd rather see us rebuilding lots of the great old places that still exist out there and are underutilized. So in a new community, this is where we fall back on the quote unquote standards or guidelines. The interesting thing to me about designing for a new community and putting parks in new communities is that it's different from an established community, because you make assumptions about who the users are going to be, because before you build a new subdivision, you're not sure exactly who lives there. You can't just survey the people that live there because they don't live there yet. There's no one there yet. So you have to make assumptions. Maybe you look at some other similar places or something. So that's all part of the mechanics of getting into new places. Yeah, you look at, okay, what are some of the norms? What are some of the standards? And what are some of the assumptions about who those people will be? And then the good, easy thing is the land's vacant, so you can build those things in, if you meet economic needs and all that sort of stuff. Inserting them into existing fabric is harder, but the advantage there is the people that live there, you already know who they are, right? And you can actually talk to them. And I think that's what we're realizing is in those situations, that's the important thing, is to find out who those people are. That ties back into environmental justice, because that's where most of the disadvantages communities are. They're in existing places, right? They're not moving out to new suburbs. There's where we can really tie into who is there now, what are their needs, and how do we address those needs. The fly in the ointment is that we're finding, though, that sometimes the outcomes of the insertion of new green space into existing places does lead to this gentrification effect. And various people have proposed different ways of addressing that. As I said, I don't necessarily have the answer. I will just say personally, I think that saying, well, we shouldn't put high quality green space into these communities because it will cause gentrification is a cop-out. Keeping places crappy is not good affordable housing policy. And I think it's patronizing to say these people, certain people shouldn't get high quality green space because it may cause gentrification, and therefore we won't do it. We need to find an alternative to say, how do we do it in the way that allows that community to reap the full benefits of it, not just the benefits of exposure to that nature experience or that park experience, but the economic benefits to that whole community. I don't have the answers to that. And there are probably other individuals who should be working on that problem who are smarter than me when it comes to the economics of redevelopment and community evolution. But that's where we should be looking, is how do we give those communities the highest quality possible green space experiences in a way that benefits them on all levels. It benefits them from the direct exposure, and it benefits them from the secondary impacts to the changes in the evolution of that community, and builds a better community for them.
Again, going back to, what they want and will use and in any community, it doesn't matter whether it's under-resourced population or a high-end population, because it's just, I think, as representing, why would say we're representing the community, we have to figure out, and it may be the same city, but two different neighborhoods, and may have the same parcel of land, but it's very different about how, what we put in those parks, because I think that piece it's about serving the people who live there. And, I think one of the reasons that gentrification often occurs is that we go in and we put things we think people should have rather than things that people want. And I think that's a real negative. And so as we're looking at, how parks can serve, it's for people where they are now. We know they increase property values, but how do we do that in a way that's positive for people who live there right now?
Yeah. And I think we'll get there. And I think there's the trend is in involving those communities more in this. And I think as they become more involved and invested themselves, and we find ways to help them achieve these kinds of goals rather than achieve them for them, so to speak.
Yeah. We had an interesting project. I won't name the city, but I worked at one city where they had put in a park in a neighborhood that was under-resourced. And the park, they put in a whole bunch of stuff that they thought they needed, and they just got vandalized.
Yeah.
And so they went back in, the city went back in and they fixed the elements that they put in there, and they got vandalized again. And so the city government, a lot of the folks were like counselors and stuff were saying, council members were saying, well, we're not going to put anything back there because they just don't appreciate it. And it got this really kind of nasty feeling around it. And I said, well, did anybody ask the neighbors that live there what they want? Because there was no process where they went in and said to the neighbors, hey, what would be the one thing that you need here? And when that conversation happened, it was very different. We want a gathering space where the moms that live here can come out and get together rather than just this baseball field that you think should go there, which we're not going to use. And so part of that was once you can get people to buy in that they have a voice in their neighborhood and their community, that the things that we're providing they'll take care of. People will take care of the things that they want. They're not going to take care of things that they don't have any reason why this even appeared, even if it's the Mac Daddy thing that we think people should have. So I think that arrogance, hopefully in our field, that arrogance of planners thinking we know what people should have is going to start to evolve a little bit more into finding out what it is that people want and will care about, and will improve their own personal quality of life and recreation of body, mind, and spirit on a daily basis for their lives, which may be very different than something that we've been exposed to in our lives.
It occurs to me that one of the things that's affected us most recently, of course, is the COVID pandemic, and how people did a few things. One, it really emphasized the need for these kinds of spaces within communities because people needed places to be outside more than ever in the urban environment, and so we saw a lot of sort of pop-up parks, I'll call them, or configuration of spaces to be park-like, or
even streets that became pop-ups. Yeah,
well, that's where I was going with this, because the question really was, how do we get more parks, right? I think part of it is to broaden our idea of what a park is. Again, we need a clear definition of what a park is, but a lot of things that we don't think of as parks might fit within that definition, including, as you said, a street that's closed off closed off at a certain time. But it occurred to me that one way to deal with some of these places is to look at how are the people there, what are they doing right now, how are they using their neighborhood in ways that are park-like. As you said, maybe places where they like to gather. Maybe there are ways to make existing spaces that are used more park-like. Now, that's not going to solve everything, because there are things that they're not doing now in their neighborhood because they literally can't, but they would be if those spaces were available. So you have to identify that and how to provide those. But I think part of it too is just looking at really how are people using the environment around them now, and how do we translate that use into what a park is for them?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think one of the other aspects that what's always been fascinating to me is kind of going back to what we talked about at the beginning, the language around this. I know that when we worked on a project in Arlington County, Virginia, an open space there is a concrete plaza for people to gather and have events. Where in Colorado, an open space is a very, very different definition, and yet both technically are classified as park spaces, right? Sure. So I think that that's something that, as a young professional, I was not aware of. It's like, the things you grow up in your state and you think everything's that way, and then when you travel around the country or even around the world, and you go, wow, things are so much different. But yet at the same time, we have this need to come up with a common language. And I think as you've been teaching, even whether it's at NC State or various other places, how are you shaping your curriculum? I know that we I know you're going to be teaching at the Parks and Recreation Emerging Professionals program that's being offered with GP Red in conjunction with the University of Colorado, Denver, starting in 2022. And so my understanding is you're teaching a class called parks planning and design or something like that, right? So
Mhm.
thinking about that's going to be a shortened, condensed, accelerated online learning program. So you have to pull out, like, of all the classes you've taught in your career and all the young professionals you've trained, how do you pull out for basically, I think it's a 3-week class, right? We have three Wednesdays or so. So how do you pull out the top things to fit under that 3-week curriculum? What are the
Well, my philosophy has always been, yeah, you can't teach everybody everything in no matter how much time you have. And really the best thing you can do is plant the seed, so that they get to thinking about these things and want to explore them more. So I think it's really twofold: is one, making sure that through a course like this, that the people involved, the students in this case, understand really, if I had to really boil it down, when I'm talking to people about parks, I really try to impress upon them the fact that parks are intentional spaces. They don't just exist on their own. I think, because parks can also be these great natural spaces. We haven't talked about, national parks and those kind of places. We've mainly been talking about urban parks here. But I think because people, parkland, the idea of park is kind of a natural space. People think they just happen. But having practiced in Colorado all these years, one of the things that's interesting is that, basically most of the population is out on this prairie that we live on here. And a place left to its own devices is basically just, grassland. A park in our mind is something much different. So it's very intentional. As a landscape architect, I have to go in and insert things. If parks are about inserting things into the space, trees and benches and whatever it is. Other parts of the country, it's about extraction, right? If you have a full forest, you go in there, and that isn't just a park. To make it a park, they have to go in and take things out. Maybe there's things in there that get removed to create clearings and spaces and places to do stuff. So these are all intentional. If you just took a piece of ground as it was and said, now it's a park, obviously in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, it's going to not really serve our intents. So the first thing I would like to impress on people is parks are intentional spaces. They exist because somebody intended to, and that somebody typically has to be up at a higher societal level, has to be at a governmental level. And one of the things I tell people is how that comes about. It actually is embedded into our Constitution through the 10th Amendment. There is an actual rationale for how governments from the top down to the local agencies are empowered constitutionally to levy taxes and use those taxes to create these benefits for people. And parks are part of that system of benefits. So again, it's very intentional. It's built into our society. And then I also talk about how it's built into common law going all the way back to ancient Rome. So this idea that we can create these kind of places, they don't just happen. They're very intentional. So that's really important to know.
So, and then, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Just, I don't mean to get you off track, but one of the things we often have to deal with is this balance of intentional creation of a space, like whether it's adding something in Colorado or extracting from North Carolina, versus the how you decide a piece of land should be more of a conservation focus, conserving the resources, and those are parks too. When you have conservation lands that are open space, so how do you make that kind of decision?
It gets back more of an understanding of about that place. And, any park designer starts with really gaining a deep understanding of what that place has, what is its makeup, what is its history. I like to look at its history going back through geologic time. I look at any place in the landscape as something on a continuum, if you will. That, we think of landscapes as static places, but they're always evolving, especially over geologic time. But even in more recent historical times, through not just natural processes, but obviously very human processes, places are always in process of change. And so to me, I look at what we're doing as an intervention that happens in a particular place along a line of change. And we have to understand what came before, and we have to project where that change will go. And so what we're doing is always kind of it's sort of, I call it an intervention, but it's like something is in motion and we're going to nudge it. That's what happens. We nudge it one way or another, and that's the intentional part.
But I know you pay close attention to, like, if there's an area, say you have a 30-acre parcel and there's an area that's got some sensitive species versus other areas that become very, very active and they're very focused. I mean, I know that's kind of like one of the first things you do, right? Is look and see what's there, so you're not destroying something of value, I guess.
Right. That's all that part of that understanding. What is a place today before we intervene, and how did it get there? What is its history? What is its timeline? What is its history? What things brought it to be where it is now, and where is it going if we don't do anything? What is its trajectory? And then as we nudge it through this intervention to satisfy our intentions, then we have to be very conscious of what we're doing. And part of that is deciding, okay, what is a value here that we don't want to knock off its course, so to speak? And what are things that we can intervene with that are less sensitive to those kind of impacts?
Cool. Well, you know, I could talk to you all day about these topics, but just in the sake of time, is there anything else that you were really hoping to kind of put out there today for our viewers?
Well, just getting back to the PREPP course, for example, I mean, why is it important for, you know, obviously the people designing a park, it's important for them to know these things, but a lot of the people that will be, they'll be interested in this discussion and maybe attending these courses are people that may be in management level or a operations level. And I think the important thing is to realize, again, parks are intentional spaces, and then I can create a park, but as I said, it has a lifespan, it has a trajectory, and that trajectory is really more impacted by the people who will manage it, the people who will operate it, the people who will use it, the programming people, the recreation people, all the people that will come into
the maintenance. Yeah, all the maintenance.
Right. That's the operations piece, right. And so I think if all of those people understand how this place came to be and what the meaning of it is and the intent, again, it gets back to that idea of intention. What is the intention for this place? And understanding how that came about and why this place is the way it is in this location. And what are the intents? What is the intention for that? Then everybody can work together towards maximizing the benefits that come from that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your time today. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm sure you're available if people want to get in touch with you. And I know you're still out there teaching and writing and doing all sorts of wonderful stuff. So thank you for your contributions to our field. We really appreciate it.
I enjoyed talking with you.